Thank you everyone for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Nick and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on our social media handles of Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Tonight, we are so thrilled to welcome Chuck Klosterman talking about his new release, The 90s, a Book. He is the best-selling author of 8 nonfiction books, 2 novels, and the short story collection Raised in Captivity. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, GQ, Esquire, Spin, The Guardian, and Billboard, among others. The 90s brought about a revolution in the human condition that we're still groping to understand. Beyond epiphenomena like Cop Killer, Titanic, and Zima, there were wholesale shifts in how society was perceived. The rise of the internet, pre-9/11 politics, and the paradoxical belief that nothing was more humiliating than trying too hard. Pop culture accelerated without the aid of a machine that remembered everything, generating an odd comfort in never being certain about anything. In the 90s, a book, Chuck Klosterman makes a home in all of it. The film, the music, the sports, the TV, the politics, the changes regarding race and class and sexuality, and the yin and yang of Oprah and Alan Greenspan. So this evening's event will include an audience Q&A. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Lastly, support Chuck and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his book from us. A link to buy the 90s will be shared in the chat a couple of times tonight. Since Chuck graciously stopped by the store, we currently have over 100 actual signed copies. You can see right here, we got them right there. So order yours while supplies last. All right, thanks so much, Chuck, for joining us, and we're excited to have you.
This is the beginning? Okay. Well, you know, this is normally the part in the event where I would say like, boy, you know, it's great to be here. But you know, it's really not great to be here because I'm not there. I am literally here, like out behind my house. You know, this book could have come out last fall, probably. We probably could have pushed it and had it come out in the fall. But we thought, well, if we wait till February, everything about the pandemic will be over and we will all be back to life. It sure seemed that way when this decision was made. But as you can see, this is not Powell's behind me. If it was, it would be a very unpopular store with extremely limited inventory. Now, you know, and it's weird, but the weird thing about this is, to me, is that it should be better to do it this way. It really should. Like, I don't have to travel. That's great. When I'm done with this, I'll just walk up to my house, you know, and talk to my kids. That'll be it, you know, no travel at all, no hotel. There can be more people at the event, in theory. They told me there was like 600 people signed up for this. It's very rare to get 600 people into a bookstore. You know, I can get people from like all over the country coming to this. There may be people from other countries, at least Canada. You know, it actually, in a way, I suppose, should replicate the experience of writing a book. Because when you write a book, you know, you are by yourself. So here I am talking about my book in the same place and kind of in the same atmosphere that I wrote it in. So it seems like this should be better, but it's not. It's bizarre, and you know, it makes me feel like I'm a totally insane person to be doing events like this. Because I'm talking and I'm looking at a picture of myself, and it seems like I'm acting or actually putting together like a videotape to send out to get auditions for acting, or even maybe in a way, it seems like I'm in a really bad movie where there's a bunch of exposition they have to get into it. So they've created this narrative conceit where a guy talks to himself on his computer to explain what's going on. I just feel crazy. Also, if there were actually the people who are watching this now, if you were in a room together, you know, I'm not really saying anything that hilarious, but a few of you might just kind of be tittering and chuckling, but there'd be a bunch of you, right? So it would sound like it's going great. right now, it feels like it's going terrible because I'm just talking to a picture of myself. But you know, that's how life is, temporarily, hopefully not forever. So I'm just going to do this as best I can. And I hope the technology doesn't break down. It is interesting. In a normal event, you worry no one's going to show up. But in a virtual event, you spend the whole time worrying the computer's going to freeze. And like it might freeze when I'm doing something weird, like I'm talking with my hands, and all of a sudden I'm like this for a real long time. And then someone captures that, and the next thing I know, my entire life is built around this time I did this by accident. So while I may not be happy to be doing it in this way, I am happy you came to this. I appreciate Powell setting this up for me. And I hope that this kind of strange conversation to no one is interesting to you. Also, as the guy said, there's this Q&A button down at the bottom of the Zoom. I really hope you ask a lot of questions because I enjoy answering them, or at least making up an answer to them. And just so you know, I always say this, you don't have to ask me questions about this book. I mean, I know this book is called The 90s, so there'll probably be questions about the 90s. You know, it'll be like, oh, what's your third favorite Oasis song or whatever. That's totally fine. I'll take those questions. But you can also ask me about anything you want. If you want to try to ask me the weirdest possible question and see if you can confuse me or throw me off, I say, go ahead. Try to out-weird me. I would love to see it. I don't really feel like that's happened before, but if somebody can do it, I'll be impressed. Okay, so why did I write a book about the 90s? Well, a lot of reasons. There's never a real easy way to answer a question like that. It's the main question someone asks you when you write a book, like, why did you do it? And if you gave a real answer, you would just say, I don't know, I was compelled to do so, because that is my real answer. I don't know why I am compelled to do what I do. I can't not do it. And it's not that writing makes me feel so good. I find that writing stops me from feeling bad. Like if I don't do any writing, I feel weird. I assume what it must be like is somebody who is really addicted to cigarettes, and that when they started smoking cigarettes, it was fun and cool and they liked doing it and it made them feel good. But then at the end, all the cigarette does is stop them from like feeling uncomfortable. That's kind of how it is for me. Like I kind of write books because I'm forced to do it by my body against my will in a way that's not even necessarily great. But for a job, it's a very good job. And you know, the publishing of these books is a complicated process, but they go together. If you want to make a living writing, you got to put the books out. So the 90s to me were interesting in a lot of different ways. Right? I graduated from high school in 1990. And then, you know, I was, 28 when the decade ended, maybe 27, 28. And so I really did experience young adulthood during this period. But this is not a memoir. And if anybody thinks that it might be, I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is not about my life. I wrote a book 20 years ago called Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. That was kind of a memoir about experiencing the 90s. It was sort of how this period felt through the prism of my own experience and all the things I did and my very specific interests at the time. This is not like that. This is more detached because I do think that there are some aspects about the 90s that are significant, and I wanted to have them kind of quantified before a lot of other people decide to revise what the period was like. And what I mean by that is I know how this works. This process of kind of contemporary history operates in this way where people consistently go back to a period and they say, well, okay, we all thought this at the time, but actually it was the complete opposite. Or we viewed this thing as significant, so obviously it couldn't have been. It was this obscure thing, like this is the process that's going to happen. The way people work through history is sort of by going back and changing their memory of it based on the way they think about the world in the present tense. They think about the past the same way they think about the world they're living in right now. So what I really wanted to try to do was write a book that is not how the 90s seem to us now, but how they seemed as they were actually unspooling. Sort of like the texture and feeling of the time as it was happening. That it wasn't that I was trying to go back and find things about the 90s that explain the way the world is now, although sometimes that does happen. For the most part, it was, why did this period of time sort of create the way people understood reality? In other words, like the culture and the politics and the sports and all these things that were happening, how did those things sort of manifest themselves in a way that made people feel like, this is how I'm supposed to view the world, or this is how the world feels to me? So it's not an attempt to transform the way people currently think about the 90s. It's not supposed to be this thing where you believed one thing when you read the book, but when you finish it, you believe something completely contradictory. What I was trying to do is just sort of capture the actual way it seemed at the time, like to kind of get away from the idea that the way things might appear to us now, or what things mean now, was how they were then. So I don't think that's how it works. I think it's a very natural process for all people, myself included. You look back on your life, or you look back on the past, and unconsciously you imagine yourself as the person you are now, but just like younger and maybe thinner, perhaps shorter. But you somehow believe that the way you view the world and the way your mind operates was the static thing, and that the experiences you had in the past were experienced by a version of you. But they were experienced by a version of you that's actually an alien, at least to the person you are now. So that was sort of my goal. I also think it's sort of consequential that the 90s were the last decade of the 20th century, but in a sense, it feels like it might be the last decade where that term makes sense, where you can frame a period of time and say there were these sort of immutable values and shared characteristics and sort of culture built into the time period, that even those people who didn't enjoy it or saw themselves as against it, or saw themselves as ideologically adversarial with what was going on at the time, they still had a full understanding that this was this kind of shared experience that maybe was invisible at the time, but seems very clear now. One thing I want to talk about, because I'm promoting this book, so I give a lot of interviews, do a lot of podcasts. Some guy from a magazine interviewed me, and he talked about this idea. Well, I talked about the idea, I guess, and he illustrated it to other people about how it feels as though the movement of time is changing, and that there's this palpable sense that we are not moving through time in the linear way we had in the past. Now, he did quote me correctly when I said this, but he left out a lot of parts that have caused a lot of other people to sort of look at this statement and assume that I'm just somebody who got old, and I'm like, oh, it used to be, things change, now things don't change. They almost like willfully misinterpreted it. So I kind of want to describe part of the thinking that went into this book, and really, I think, informed a lot of the ways that I thought about the 90s. Okay, it's a theory, and it's not even my theory. It's a theory by a guy named Mark Fisher, who was a kind of a British cultural critic. He died real young. He's not alive anymore. A very brilliant person. He was a kind of an anti-capitalist sort of theorist, but in my view, his most interesting ideas tend to be related to culture. And the idea that he kind of forwarded near the end of his life was something called the slow cancellation of the future. And what this means in simplest terms is that as we've sort of built up this massive collective body of content, really starting after World War II, before that too, but really it accelerates after World War II. And we're kind of moving through history, and things become popular and then they fade from popularity and something replaces them. Or ideas exist and a new artist or a new writer or however you want, a new politician sees these pre-existing ideas, perhaps even like a new economist, sees these pre-existing ideas and sort of builds something new beyond that, almost using the previous idea as like the jumping off point. But something strange has happened with the advent of the internet, which is that it doesn't seem as though time is still moving in this linear way, because we now have instant access to all content that exists. So if in the past, if time was like a road and somebody was walking down that road, the scenery would change along the way. And perhaps what they saw a few miles back would be gone entirely unless they turned around and walked back in a very conscious manner to see it again. It was like time was this road. Because of the internet and a lot of other things, but the internet primarily, culture is now more like a real shallow ocean. Like it's very vast, it's very wide, but it's not very deep. And you can go to any part of it. You can get in your little theoretical rowboat, go to any part of this ocean you want with a bucket and scoop up the past. And it creates this sense that we're living in a perpetual now, that we're not moving through time as much as we are just making everything new to some degree, partially retro. The example this guy used, and this is Fisher's example, not mine, but he covered a genre of music called post-punk in the 80s. And one day he's watching television in 2011 or whatever, and he sees this band, and he is certain that this must have been a band from the 80s he missed. They're not only playing the style of post-punk, they're dressed like people from the 80s. And it's not just that they're dressed that way. There's no sort of ironic value to this. This is actually just the way they're presenting themselves. The video is being shot through a lens that looks exactly as it would have in the 80s. Like everything about it is exactly the way the 80s would have captured this genre of music. But then he finds out, that it's not some band that he just somehow did not realize existed. It was the Arctic Monkeys, which were a new band. And yet everything about their identity was built through the past. And it wasn't their attempt to pay homage to the past. They weren't saying oh, it's very funny. We're doing this because it shows our sense of history. It actually is how the band operates. There's many examples of this. You look at television, for example. If you take footage, say 15 seconds of TV footage from some obscure show from 1969, and then you take some obscure footage from a show in 1979. So you have little bits from these two shows 10 years apart, and you show them to a child. The child will know which one came first. A child will be able to deduce both visually and in the way the whole thing is presented that one came before the other in this 10-year window. I don't think that would happen now with a television show, say from 2003, and a television show from now. I think they would be indistinguishable for someone who is not familiar with either thing, both in the way that people talk, the way it looks, the tonality of how ideas are expressed, the language. Something seems to be happening where we are no longer moving forward through time in this way where certain ideas from the past are lost or consciously sort of upended. It's as if all this time is occurring simultaneously. And this is why I say it kind of creates this sense of perpetual now. I mean, things change in politics. That's one aspect that it does seem different, but the presentation of those politics and the way they are described by the media, the expectation of the person following the news, it seems as though it is slowed down. And it is not just the fact that I've gotten older. This really hadn't occurred to me. I felt, but until I heard someone older. And I'm not so much arguing that this is a terrible thing. It's just strange. And I think for somebody who really follows, art or whatever, this could be a problem. And what is interesting about the 90s is that this had not yet happened. The 90s were still progressing in the same trajectory previous decades had done. So when we look at this period of time, we can sort of see the way time operated in the 20th century, but through these things that are not that distant. The 90s feel further away than they actually are. And that's like, I think, a common experience. I'm sure people in the 1970s felt like, well, the 50s are distant now. We watch Happy Days and we watch Laverne and Shirley and we watch Grease, and it seems like this forgotten thing. But there's some second layer here of strangeness that is creating the sense that the 90s were different in both sort of cultural, but also like mechanical ways. And that's really kind of what prompted me to want to do this book, because like I wanted to try to capture the way this was in some ways before someone else did it and started shifting a lot of the caricatures and the cliches, because it seems real reductionist to say that, and I think people might not like hearing this, but in some ways it's like the characters and cliches of a period are what become the historical memory. That we're not really remembering the actual events as much as sort of the kind of like the projection of it from versions of satire, or someone doing the simplest version of a complex idea. Those are the things that seem to make us recall, like, the 1920s as being this certain way, or the 1950s as being this certain way. It's not the literal things as much as sort of the interpretive things. And I kind of wanted to get in and do the literal reading of this period before all those other interpretations sort of emerge. Okay, so it is, now we're 25 minutes in. I see down in the Q&A section, there's already 68 questions. I don't know how many of them will be interesting and how many might just be, I don't know, Zap Dingbats or whatever. So I was considering, reading a little bit about this book, from this book, and talking about it. I think I'm going to maybe read for 2 minutes. Okay. Just the very beginning of the book, the introduction, The 90s began on January 1st of 1990, except for the fact that, of course, they did not. Decades are about cultural perception, and culture can't read a clock. The 1950s started in the 1940s. The 60s began when John Kennedy demanded we go to the moon in 1962 and ended with the shooting at Kent State in May of 1970. The 70s were conceived the morning after Altamont in 1969 and expired during the opening credits of American Gigolo, which means there were 5 months when the 60s and the 70s were happening at the same time. It felt like the 80s might live forever when the Berlin Wall fell in November of '89, but that was actually the onset of the euthanasia, though it took another 2 years for the patient to die. I start the book in this way because I do think that what is perhaps most interesting about any period of time is when it actually begins and when it feels like it begins. Okay, it's become common to say that the 90s begin when the Berlin Wall fell in fall, early winter of '89, and then it ends on September 11th of 2001. And in this book, I do sort of assert that 9/11 is the end of the 90s. I don't see the fall of the Berlin Wall, though, as the beginning of this period. And the reason I don't is because the 1990s, and particularly like the year 1990, was sort of like the 80s on autopilot. If you look back to what was happening in 1990, it's like, well, Twin Peaks is on television, right? But Cheers is the most popular show. So like this thing from the 80s is still the dominant kind of icon of television. Joe Montana is still the best player in the NFL. people were still ordering things from like Christmas, like the New Kids on the Block had a huge tour. A lot of these vestiges of the 80s were still really alive and in some ways flourishing. And it wasn't until the release of Nevermind by Nirvana in 1991 that the 90s sort of take on the characteristics that we now sort of offhandedly associate with that period. And it wasn't that this album was so much better than any record that had come before, or that it just, everybody who heard it suddenly became a different person, moved their mind mentally through this portal. It wasn't that. It was that because it was a good record and because it seemed to be the perfect manifestation of mainstreaming counterculture ideas, like taking these aspects of music and sort of creating this really kind of glossy, really like metal sounding record in a lot of ways. Gave people this artifact where they could, the way he dresses, the way he acts, his view about success, his view about fame. This is the way we can now understand what a young person in 1991 is like. And it kind of rippled through the culture in many non-musical ways. I mean, I write in this book about there was a Subaru ad where they're talking about punk rock in this ad and describing how this car, this new Subaru Impreza, is like a way to sort of find what's really good about a car in the same way punk rock really broke through all the limitations of like progressive rock in the 70s. What they're really talking though is about Nirvana. It's just that you couldn't talk directly about Nirvana in a commercial. One, because they would have never participated. And two, that would be self-defeating. You had to actually adopt the things that Nirvana seemed or alleged to be expressing. And that became this kind of, this perception we have about, in the 90s, like, nobody wanted to sell out. That was a huge thing to almost everyone I knew. That this idea that you didn't want to try to be beloved by people who weren't like you. There was something desperate and pathetic about that. It's different now with social media. The idea is to sort of collect as many people as you can. The largest possible audience is always the best audience. But in the 1990s, in pretty much every genre of everything, there was this concept that was really entrenched, that you did not want to in any way compromise your integrity. And what integrity meant at this time was amorphous. It was this idea that your desire to be an artist, to be a creative person, was incredibly specific and individual. And if it easily and kind of rapidly could be accessed by people who were unlike you, it was seen as like a very sad thing, and it was a damaging thing in some ways. I mean, I think it's kind of funny. I'm promoting this book on the 90s, so I'm thinking about the 90s. I just wrote this book on the 90s, a year or whatever. I wrote it during the pandemic. I was constantly thinking about these 90s principles and the idea of selling out, which is something I hadn't really thought about in over a decade in any kind of real way. I was thinking about it all the time again. And now when I promote this book, and that's what I'm doing right now. I mean, I enjoy doing this, but this is a promotional thing. I'm trying to sell this book. I feel incredibly embarrassed by it. And I have this desire to sort of undercut the book at every possibility, because I'm back in this mindset that there is something like really desperate and kind of artistically unsophisticated about trying to do something that people just like, that they're just giving people something they like. Even though that's the whole idea. Like, why am I here? Why am I doing this if I don't want people to buy this book? And I have to admit, part of me wants to try to convince you not to, because somehow I think it would make the book better. It makes no sense at all. I have still been kind of messed up by what happened in the 90s, because in some ways I'm still that person. Okay, so I've read one paragraph of my book. That counts as a reading to me. I'm going to go down to this Q&A here, and I'm going to see what these questions are. Okay. First question is Chuck. That's me. What is your favorite book or books? Boy, that's a big question to begin with. I really believe that the biggest books in anyone's life are the books that they read between like 6th and 10th grade. And I know that seems odd to people. If you tell someone, it's like, oh, I read your book, seemed a little bit like YA or whatever, that's a real insult. Sometimes people criticize my books and tell me, or they attempt to by telling me that they kind of seem like the thing, like a 12th grader who thinks he's smart reads. But you know what? Those are the books I remember in a real profound way. I mean, I read Animal Farm in 7th grade. That was a big deal to me. I still remember parts of that book in a way that with a vivid sort of just like clarity that I don't feel about books I read 2 days ago. I read that big book Sapiens. I'm sure many people out here are familiar with this. It's this big book about the history of mankind. I loved it. Okay, it was such a fun reading experience. It was so informative. It was so interesting. The guy did a really good job of sort of looking at the evolution of culture in a way that didn't seem like kind of prehistory. It just sort of seemed like someone describing the way the world works at a different time. And as I was reading that book, I was constantly saying to myself, remember this thing you just read, like this line you just read, remember this. And I could feel it just evaporating, the way it is when like you wake up in the morning and you had a dream and you want to tell someone this dream and you can feel it dissolve almost in your mind as it's happening. That happens to me all the time now. But those books I read when I was in junior high, like Animal Farm, Richard Rhett's Black Boy, that was a big one. Season on the Brink, the John Feinstein book about the Indiana Hoosiers. Man, I read that book probably 5 times in high school. I never read books twice now, but so if you ask me like, what are my favorite books? I'm actually going to tell you books that, I haven't probably looked at in 40 years. Okay, a guy named Christopher Bauer. You said you think of 9/11 as the end of the 90s. Is there any point other than the obvious, of course, that you think of as the beginning? Well, I guess I did answer that. Like I use Nevermind sort of as my example of when I think the immutable culture of the 90s began. I think you could pick other things here. I do like somebody was arguing that they think the end of the 90s was actually when Facebook starts. And I guess I could see that that sort of contention. I mean, in terms of the internet, that is kind of true because, when we talk about the internet of the 90s, we all understand that that's when it began. And we think about the early internet as this transformative device. And yet when people talk about the early internet, they often use language and arguments that really only apply to social media. Like if you ask anybody like, what don't you like about the internet? They're going to list a bunch of stuff, okay? And they're almost all going to be connected to the experience of being on Twitter or the experience of being on Facebook or what TikTok does or Instagram. Like no one's going to say, you know what I hate about the internet? It makes getting driving directions real easy. I hate that. Or it's like, I was looking for a recipe for like chicken Parmesan. I found it instantly. Like nobody complains about these things. Everyone looks at them and is like, oh yeah, the things of the early internet are still the things we like about it. It's what became the internet that people don't like. Okay, guys asked me, he says in Eating the Dinosaur, he goes, you kind of sympathize with the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, mainly due to his concerns about the exponential growth of technology. Based on the 14 years since then, do you feel that sympathy has grown or abated, and why? I don't know if I was ever sympathetic to him. I just sort of made an argument that people don't want to hear, which is that this crazy murderer may have been right about some things about the culture. I mean, you obviously should not be sending bombs to professors you've never met. You can look at him as either mentally ill, or if he's not mentally ill, that's even worse in a way. But the one thing that he was right about in many ways was the internet. If you go back and read like the manifesto he published, he is describing the internet in a way that seems amazingly prescient, particularly since he obviously had never used it. He was living in a cabin in Montana since like 1973 with no electricity or running water. So it wasn't like he was going on AOL, yet his assumption of what technology would do and how it would manifest itself through the internet is bizarrely accurate. So does this mean I sympathize with him? No, I don't want to get any federal watch list because I said, it's like I'm not telling people that, the Unabomber had some great ideas. I'm just saying that people who are bad can also be right sometimes. Okay, the 90s might well be the last decade, as we always understood and used and described. How do you think we will be describing eras after that? Okay, so this person is saying that if I'm asserting that the 90s are kind of the last decade, what are we going to call time after that? Well, okay, you know what the safe answer is? The safe answer is that time is going to move forward, and suddenly the first 10 years of the 21st century will seem to have some kind of shared characteristics. And if you move further still, maybe that second 10-year period will suddenly seem, I'm sure it'll be related to Trump in some way, but like it will seem as though the ideas from that period are easier to classify. We will probably project things back onto that period. I guess what I'm saying is I think that those projections are going to be entirely personal. Now, I know someone is going to say, well, your assumption of the 90s, that's personal. You're a person. You can't get outside of your own mind. It's like, yeah, I know. That's true. I am who I am. I think the way I think. But there are ideas about objectivity that used to exist in the past, and I guess still sort of inform the way I think about journalism. I know it is now unpopular to be a fan of objectivity, which is crazy to me. The idea that because what people will say is they're like, well, objectivity is a waste of time because you're not a robot. No one can be perfectly objective. Well, it's true. Nobody can be perfectly objective. But the idea is that you try to recognize your biases constantly, and that the biases you have are the main things that inform the way you pursue an idea. So you're not going to be perfectly objective, but you're trying to get close. It certainly makes no sense to say, well, it's impossible to have, perfect objectivity. So therefore, everything needs to be subjective. That makes no sense. That would be like someone saying like, well, it's impossible to get rid of all the guns in America. So let's just end all gun laws. Because it's like, it's like we can't do it. We can't perfectly do it. So let's just give up. It's like, that's crazy. So I guess my answer to your question is they probably will come up with something to describe the decades, but I might disagree with it. Okay. I'm only a few chapters in, says Stephen Jernak, but there's already an effort made to bookend the 90s with a beginning and an end. When we look back on those last 2 years, do you think there will be a beginning? Okay, so very similar question before. I realized I raised this sort of problem by saying, because this is the last decade, how are we going to deal with the idea that time, at least on the calendar, is going to keep moving? Okay, here's somebody is asking me about like, why is there not more hip hop in this book? There is a section on Tupac Shakur. I do talk about Arrested Development. I do talk about Two Live Crew in their trial, not really their music so much. I talk about Eminem. But here's the main reason there's not more hip hop in this book. Okay. I wrote about grunge music and sort of the effect that I felt it had on a larger zeitgeist. And then I talk about, Liz Phair here and there. I talk about Alanis Morissette. There's music throughout the book. There's a lot of music I didn't talk about. I didn't talk about Britpop, for example. Britpop was an incredibly significant part of musical culture during that decade. But I was like, well, I'm not going to, I can either do it totally in passing or I have to write an entire section on Britpop. And if I'm going to write about Britpop, then I also need to write about indie rock, because in some ways that was just as essential and kind of really flourishing at the same time. Like, like indie rock's kind of a weird way to call them now, but like, okay, like Pavement, the band Pavement, I think is mentioned in 2 sentences in this book. Seemingly you could have written an entire chapter about Pavement, but I just had to make a choice. Then there's also teen pop and like Britney Spears and all that stuff at the end. Well, if I would have written about grunge and hip hop and indie rock, I would have had to written about that. So now it's like we've got all these chapters about music, and now either the book is mostly about music, or I have to do the exact same thing with every other thing I write about. So I have to talk about every possible sport that had significance and every political event that mattered and all of these, maybe write about architecture, maybe write about visual arts. I had to make some choices, right? So what I tried to do was pick the things that I thought would put me in a position to talk about the ideas I really wanted to get to. And also working within the premise that like, it was, still a monoculture. So the things that were most popular are the things that kind of need to be addressed. Okay. Someone asked me about what side I have between Motley Crue and Pearl Jam. Seems bizarre that battle is still being waged. How carefully have you cultivated your background for this event? Understanding, of course, that the Gen Xers in your so they asked me how much did I curate the background for this Zoom event, and then they throw in, because you're like a Gen Xer, like you won't admit it. I guess that obviously, like the poster I put up, I didn't put it in a place that would be stupid. Like I didn't put it on the floor. I guess it's curated. I mean, I did move some things around just before the event started. There was like a golf club. I don't play golf, but I have golf clubs. I had a golf club that was kind of in a weird spot, so I moved that. I guess that's some curation. What's your favorite 90s movie? It is the movie Slacker, which I did not write much about in this book. I just mentioned it a few times. For a couple of reasons. One, the director, Richard Linklater, I interviewed for a book called What If We're Wrong? So it seemed kind of odd to talk about him again in a different book. My wife did a book on an oral history of Dazed and Confused, which he's in it a lot. And I was like, it's going to seem like our family's his publicist if I keep writing about Slacker. Plus, Slacker was a small thing. Like it wasn't like there are many people, I'm sure, watching this who have never heard of that film. So it's like I was looking for things that were like, I read about Titanic, Titanic and Slacker are very different movies. Somebody wants to know if there's anything about the show 15 in the book. 15 was a very popular Canadian teen show that it was like a soap opera of 15-year-old kids in Canada. It's predates that show Degrassi. There is not, I am afraid to admit, I just do not discuss 15 in this book. Let's see. As a football fan, do you have an opinion on the NCAA transfer portal and its impact on the overall games, as players can choose and transfer in ways never before? Okay, I'm gonna give a short answer to this. Things like the transfer portal and like the name and likeness stuff for college sports, it's very hard to take an ethical or moral stance against that. Like, it seems weird to say like players should not have the freedom to go to the school they want. And if they can make money, they shouldn't be able to. It seems crazy to say that. But here's the other thing. Why do we care about these things? Why do we care about the players making money? Why do we care about the players being able to have freedom of mobility? It's because there is a concept of college sports. And people like me who generally prefer college sports to pro sports, in a lot of ways, there are things that we see in college football that we can't see at the pro level. And my fear is that these things that are ethically probably proper to do are going to change that product. So it's a weird thing. It's like we were kind of shifting our minds as consumers of sports to this idea that we need to look at an athlete the same way we look at a coal miner. and we need to be really, they need a union, they need to be protected from like, all these, these unfair capitalist forces or all these things. It's like, I get that. That makes sense. Of course, it sounds good when you say it. But if these things change college football in a way that makes people less interested in Auburn, Alabama, less interested in Michigan, Ohio State, that they don't want to watch MAC games on Tuesday. Something changes about the sport. The fact that we gave them these benefits are gonna end up being to their detriment. I mean, I think this is something that is just not considered enough in the player empowerment era, which is that we can't operate from the position that these things are supposed to inherently exist. That to make a lot of money playing pro football is just something that's supposed to happen. That if you're a pro basketball player, you have all these things that you can kind of expect, where you play, what you make, who you play with, all of these things. That's all fine in the short term, but in the long term, if it changes the way people feel about these sports, the sports themselves will collapse. You have to have some part of you that says, okay, we need to be thinking about how these laws, rules, however you look at them, how these aspects change or complicate the sport itself, as opposed to what would be most beneficial to somebody currently involved with it. Who has a better post-Oasis musical output, Noel or Liam Gallagher? I would say Noel, but I thought Noel had better output when Oasis was together. I think the best moments of Oasis, and who I love, tend to be like Don't Look Back in Anger, or when he sings the chorus on Acquiesce. Like when Noel sings, I prefer it, and he's also the songwriter. So it's a really easy side for me to take. Okay, somebody asked me, did I work in Akron, Ohio in the 90s? And what are some of my memories of Akron? I did. I worked at the Akron Beacon Journal from 1998 to 2002. I have many friends there, and it was kind of an interesting middle period of my life. That's when I wrote Fargo Rock City, and a lot of Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs was in this apartment in the Merriman Valley of Akron, Ohio. One thing I really remember is going to a Chinese restaurant called the Platinum Dragon. It was so bizarre to move to New York, because I moved to New York after I lived in Akron, and I lived in New York for 15 years. I'm in Portland now, but New York will always be my favorite city in a lot of ways, and there's no experience like it. I mean, New York is so unlike the rest of America. It's like I really underrated how different New York was from the rest of the country. But here's the crazy thing. Why was the Chinese food better in Akron, Ohio? I'll never understand that. There was also this place out kind of by Summit Mall where you could get these pot stickers. I can't remember what the place was called. They're the best pot stickers I've ever had in my life. Now, how could this be? Like, what happened in the prehistory of Akron that brought these wonderful Chinese chefs to town? I don't. I mean, I watched that documentary on General Tso's chicken, and I guess in some ways it kind of explains it. If you want to watch a film that will explain the way culture actually works, as opposed to the way it's described through most kind of like entertainment media, watch this documentary about General Tso's chicken. And it really sort of illustrates the way that ideas, and specifically like ideas that are insular, kind of become collective. But I mean, bottom line is, worked out great for Akron, at least in that specific world of eating General Tso's chicken. Okay, I first discovered you, Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. Over the 18 years, you spent a lot of time reflecting on your discussions, blah, 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 blah. Many of my reflections have changed over the years. What perspective did you discuss then that you'd want to revisit? Well, that's an interesting question. All these questions have been interesting to me, at least. When you write a book, you think the hardest part should be the typing or the research or sort of the emotional investment that you have to put into that book. That should be the hardest part. But in some ways, the hardest part is the fact that you have to remain the person who wrote that book, and the book will never change, and you will. Like the book is frozen in amber. Those early books I wrote in Akron, it's like they still exist. They were written by a 28-year-old, a version of me that I have no relationship to now. Like I think almost everything about me might be different. Maybe people who know me might be better at describing if that's true or not. But like in so many ways, the way I think, especially about culture, have completely shifted. So sometimes somebody will come to me and they've just read Fargo Rock City, which came out in 2001. Like they just read it a week ago, and they'll ask me a question like, "Oh, you said Cinderella, like had this hairstyle or whatever. Do you believe?" It's like, and they're telling me stuff, and I'm like, it sounds like something I could have said or could have written, but I haven't read that book since I wrote it, and it's like I'm talking about this other person that I know, that I used to know, or maybe and like I've totally lost touch with. So there is a ton in those first 2 or 3 books that if I could rewrite would be totally different. And in fact, I mean, this is going to sound arrogant, but like if I wrote Fargo Rock City now, it would be very good. Like I could really do a good job on this book now, because after I wrote it, I ended up talking about it for 20 years or whatever, and I've learned all these other things. But it wouldn't be the same book. And I don't think people would like it as much. It would probably seem kind of clinical and sterile. It wouldn't be nearly as emotional. I definitely wouldn't talk about my own life as much. I mean, that's to me, the craziest thing about when I just look back on things that I've done, like that book, Killing Yourself to Live. I guess that was my 3rd book. I cannot believe how casually I talked about myself and people I knew and women I had relationships with. I just did it. I was like, well, I'll just do it. It's not that I was like, I shouldn't be doing this, but I'll do it anyways. I just did it, and I would never do that now. I would never write about myself that, candidly. I would never talk about other people so casually. It's, you hate, it's like that Silkworm has a song, Don't Look Back, and I guess Boston has a song, Don't Look Back. Both bands are making a good point. Okay, you in your 20s for most of the 90s, if you could have experienced that time period at a different age, what age would it be? Exactly when I did. I'm very glad that my young adulthood happened in the 90s. That it was the perfect time to be that age. I feel so fortunate that I was at college when sort of music changed, and like in 91 or whatever, like I could experience it in real time. This idea that we were all into like Guns N' Roses and Rat and stuff, and then all of a sudden it's like now it's this, and it's like it was very clear. You could see like, oh, now we like Liz Phair, now we like we're into Tori Amos and all these things, and I could feel it happening, I could see it happening. I am glad I was there for that. One thing, I got 2 kids. My son is 8 and my daughter is 6, and I do worry about the world that they're going to live in. I mean, and people are like, oh, because the climate change is like, yes, sort of, but just because things are weirder now. I don't. I'm sure people in the 90s felt that way. I'm sure people in the 90s who were my age were like, I'm glad I grew up in the 70s, but there's been kind of a weird acceleration of weirdness. Somebody says you don't hear much about PCP anymore. Do you have a guess of why that is? Well, I mean, he's asking me why angel dust is less in the news. It was in the news a lot when I was younger. It was often like part of after school specials. And there was often this built-in idea that like, if you took PCP, you might have like superhuman strength. I think there's an episode of that show Cops, which of course now is like, we shouldn't propaganda even talk about it. It's like, propaganda or whatever. But that show Cops, one of the early episodes, like a guy on PCP like fights with a canine dog, like one of those German shepherds. So there was this idea that somehow that PCP was not just a drug, but it was almost like would shoot you into this different sort of existence where you were like the Incredible Hulk or whatever. I think that it must have just become less popular. I mean, for a while, people would they would put a little sprinkle PCP onto marijuana, and then they would sell marijuana for a very high price. They would say it's really, great marijuana, when it was actually very cheap marijuana that just had PCP on it. So if you smoked it, you'd hallucinate, like faces would change and stuff, and then you kind of chase that high for the rest of your life. But I don't know, maybe someone should bring PCP back. Maybe I don't know. Maybe there's an opening for the market. Okay. What do you expect to happen to Hollywood over the next decade? I think that they're going to probably go through some sort of fiscal transformation that's going to result in films that seem pretty much identical to the films we're seeing now. Were you ever approached to write about sports for The Athletic? The website, The Athletic? I don't know. I don't know if I was. I think it might have been that when it started, I was at Grantland. So then I would have been seen as maybe off limits. Was that right? Could that be? I don't know. Any plans to make more episodes of Music Exists? That was a podcast I did with my friend Chris Ryan. No plans to do it again. It was fun to do, but I find podcasting kind of stressful. I mean, when I write, I can really sculpt the thing into what I want it to be. And I can go over it over and over and over again. Like, I mentioned I haven't read, Fugger Rock City since I wrote it. That's true. I bet I read it 1,000 times while I was writing it because I'm just very obsessive about going over sentences. I'm always trying to make sentences more straight. Like I want the sentences to be entertaining and interesting and clear. And all three of those things I think are equally important. So the time I spend editing my work is always to simplify it, make it straighter. So I can't remember what the question was now. It was something that was regarding, I'm sorry. Do you think the 90s seemed more innocent at the time because we were younger and it was pre 9/11, or they just were, or perhaps you disagree? I don't think of the 90s as an innocent time. I mean, that wasn't really how it was. I'm not so sure about the loss of innocence in general over time as much as maybe the changing view of what constitutes innocence. I think a modern parent almost feels this obligation to have conversations with their kids now, which in the 90s would have been perceived as damaging. Like, why are you forcing a kid to confront these ideas now? They're 7 or whatever. Like, why, and that kind of keeps changing. So I don't really know about innocence. It's an interesting question. Okay, it's almost 6 here in Portland. So here's a question. One last guy. Hey, Chuck, I've got 3 questions. Answer as many as you want. What was the adjustment from New York City to Portland, Oregon like? Well, at first when I moved here in 2017, it was like, boy, it's easier to live here. Like, I moved to Portland. It's this beautiful city. The weather to me is great because I love when it rains. I have a steel roof on my house, so I love hearing it rain at night. Summers are beautiful. It was so easy to get the kids in school, all these things. And then in the last couple of years, Portland has just become a completely different place. And now it seems stranger than New York seemed when I moved there. When I moved to New York from Akron, they said oh, it's going to take you 6 months to get used to it. It took me 6 days because I just suddenly found so many people who were exactly like me. I had never had an experience where I met so many people who seemed to kind of talk and think the way I did. And now in Portland, it's very difficult to find. I mean, Portland is stranger than I thought it would be, as it turns out. Like, I like living here. I love raising my kids here. But in some ways, you know, like you'll watch like Fox News and they have this image of America and it's a completely distorted, unrealistic of what America is like. Like they talk about America like it's this place that every person's like, that's not how it is. It's kind of that way in Portland, though. Like Portland actually is in some ways like this incredible like almost like dystopian vision of what could happen to a community. It's very strange. How did you decide? But I mean, that said, I like living in Portland. I'm staying here. Like it's crazy here now, but I still like it. How did you decide what 90s pop culture elements to include? I've talked about that quite a bit. Did you read Francis Fukuyama about the argument about kind of the end of history? That is mentioned in the book, the idea of the end of history, which was a popular idea in the, you know, very early 90s, this idea that sort of like, I don't know, neoliberalism had succeeded and that the way that America functioned and sort of the way we had constructed our government and society would just be the way it would always be. I don't think anyone believes that now. Even though, you know, I mentioned earlier how there seems to be this stasis, how it seems that you know, after all those years of culture accelerating, like during the 90s, whenever I wrote stories for newspapers, I was always talking about the acceleration of culture. And then the internet happens. And it seems like the internet is going to be the ultimate accelerant of culture. And yet it has become a decelerant in some ways. That we are now kind of in this kind of molasses period where it is hard to get back on that kind of march through time that it seems like humanity is supposed to experience. But with that, I think I will end my talk. I really appreciate everybody who sat through this, and I hope it wasn't boring. And if it was, write me a letter and tell me you were bored, and I will probably throw it away, but maybe it will change my view of the world. So thanks. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Chuck. Thanks for joining us tonight. And thanks to all of you out there for joining us. And it's great questions and all that kind of stuff. Please consider purchasing a copy of the 90s. We currently have around 100 signed copies. So just if you order if you order through pals.com now, you will get one of the signed copies. So it's as long as the supplies last. So. And while you're there, be sure to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events. And we look forward to seeing you at another one of our events very soon. So have an excellent evening, everyone. Thanks again, Chuck.